The mist-choked cliffs of Missoula, Montana still echoed with the screech of twisted metal as my SUV plummeted down the ravine. Now I lay shattered in a St. Patrick Medical Center bed, trapped behind a mask of unresponsive skin. My husband Trevor leaned over my broken body, his breath smelling of expensive bourbon and betrayal. "Even if she wakes up, she'll never walk again," he whispered, his voice dripping with predatory satisfaction. "And legally, everything becomes mine." My stepsister Paige smirked from the shadows, her eyes gleaming with greed. "What about the trust money?" she hissed. Trevor chuckled, clutching a legal file. "Once the conservatorship is approved, we're rich." They thought I was a vegetable. They didn't know I heard every word. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. Smash that like button and subscribe if you've ever been betrayed and had to rebuild from nothing, because you won't believe the cold-blooded move I'm about to make next. The sterile white ceiling of St. Patrick Hospital was the first thing I saw when the darkness finally receded. It wasn't a cinematic awakening. There were no gasps, no dramatic fluttering of eyelashes. My eyes simply opened, and the clinical reality of Missoula's premier trauma center flooded my senses. My legs felt like distant, heavy anchors tethered to a body that no longer recognized them. The neurologist, Dr. Renee Callister, stood over me with a clipboard, her expression a mix of professional neutrality and a flicker of something that looked suspiciously like pity. "Lillian, you're back with us," she said softly. "The accident caused significant spinal compression and a localized cerebral edema. Physically, the road to recovery will be long. You may have to learn to walk again from scratch. But mentally, I need to know if you can hear me." I didn't speak. I couldn't. Not because of the trauma, but because my brain, the mind of a quantitative risk modeler, was already running simulations. I remembered the cliff. I remembered the sudden violent jolt of the SUV, and I remembered the voices. Trevor's voice. Paige's laugh. "I can hear you," I finally rasped. My voice sounded like grinding gravel. Over the next 48 hours, the tragedy of my life began to unfold, not through my physical pain, but through the cold, hard data of my existence. Trevor rarely visited. When he did, he stayed for exactly 7 minutes. I timed him on the wall clock. He would pace the room smelling of expensive cologne and the crisp mountain air of the Bitterroot Valley never meeting my eyes. He'd pat my hand with a performative sympathy that made my skin crawl, then vanish, claiming urgent brokerage meetings at his real estate firm. The first red flag wasn't emotional, it was financial. On the third day, a billing coordinator from the hospital administration entered my room, looking deeply uncomfortable. "Mrs. Maddox, I'm so sorry to disturb your recovery, but we've had an issue with the primary payment method on file for your physical therapy suite. The transaction was declined. When we contacted your bank, they informed us that the joint account has been closed." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the hospital's air conditioning. "Closed." "Yes, ma'am. And the secondary credit card was flagged for exceeding its limit. We've been trying to reach Mr. Maddox, but he hasn't returned our calls." I looked at the woman, my mind whirring. As a risk modeler, I dealt in probabilities. The probability of Trevor accidentally closing our primary liquidity source while his wife lay in a coma was 0%. The probability of him intentionally isolating my funds was 99.9%. Later that evening, Dr. Callister returned. She closed the door firmly behind her and sat on the edge of my bed. She wasn't holding a chart this time. She was holding a heavy silence. "Lillian, I'm going to step outside my strictly medical role for a moment," she whispered. "Your husband has filed an emergency petition with the Missoula County Court. He's seeking financial conservatorship. He's submitted an affidavit claiming that due to your prolonged cognitive impairment and unstable mental state following the crash, you are no longer capable of managing your affairs." She leaned closer, her eyes sharp. "He asked me to sign a medical certification confirming your permanent incapacity." I refused. I told him it was too early to tell. But Lillian, he's not waiting for me. He's brought in an outside consultant, a woman named Judith Caraway, to audit your fitness. The name hit me like a physical blow. Judith Caraway, the wealth guardian. She wasn't a doctor. She was a shark who specialized in helping greedy relatives legally hijack family trusts under the guise of protection. They think I'm a broken calculator, Dr. Callister. I said, my voice gaining a deadly rhythmic steadiness. They think because I can't move my legs, I can't see the numbers moving on the ledger. He's moving fast, Callister warned. The hearing is in 10 days. If the judge signs that order, Trevor gets total control over your assets, including your grandmother's trust. I looked out the window toward the dark outlines of the Montana mountains. My grandmother, Margot Vale, had built North Pass Freight Analytics from a single desk in a warehouse. She taught me that in logistics, the person who controls the bottleneck controls the entire route. Trevor thought I was the cargo helpless being moved at his whim. He didn't realize I was the analyst who knew every mile of the terrain. I need a phone, I said, and I need a lawyer. Not Trevor's lawyer. I need Calvin Driscoll. The trust litigator. Callister blinked. He's formidable. He worked for your grandmother, didn't he? He's the only man in Montana who hates a fraudulent ledger more than I do, I replied. That night, while the hospital slept, I lay in the dark performing mental math. The trust was valued at $22.4 million. Trevor's real estate firm was currently over-leveraged on 3 luxury developments in downtown Missoula. I knew this because I had audited his personal books 6 months ago when I noticed irregularities in our tax returns. He wasn't just committing a crime of opportunity, he was committing a crime of desperation. He needed my $22 million to save his failing empire. He and Paige, my own stepsister, had calculated that I was the weakest link in their financial chain. When Trevor finally showed up the next morning, he brought a bouquet of wilted lilies and a stack of papers. Lily honey. He said, his voice a sickeningly sweet honey. The doctors are worried about the stress of the bills. I've talked to Judith, and we think the best way to protect you is to let me handle the administrative side of things for a while. Just sign these, it's just a temporary power of attorney so I can pay the hospital. I looked at the documents. They weren't power of attorney forms. They were the initial filings for the conservatorship disguised by a predatory cover letter. He was asking me to sign away my personhood. I looked him straight in the eye, my face a mask of exhaustion and cognitive fog. My hands. They shake too much, Trevor, I whispered, letting a tear slip down my cheek. Can it wait? I'm so tired. Of course, darling, he said, his eyes flashing with a mix of frustration and greed. He leaned in and kissed my forehead. It felt like the touch of a snake. Rest. I'll take care of everything. I've already moved some things around to make sure we're secure. The moment the door clicked shut, I reached for the burner phone Dr. Callister had smuggled in for me. I dialed a number I had memorized years ago. Calvin, I said when the line picked up. This is Lillian Hartwell. I have a risk variables report that needs immediate attention. The threat level is critical. And Calvin, I don't want to just stop them. I want to liquidate them. There was a pause on the other end, then the calm, gravelly voice of the most dangerous lawyer in the Pacific Northwest. Lillian, I was wondering when you'd call. I've already flagged the unusual activity on the North Pass ledger. Where do we start? We start with the debt. I said, a cold smile finally touching my lips. Trevor thinks he's buying my life. I want you to start buying his. I spent the rest of the night staring at the heart monitor, the rhythmic beep, 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 matching the ticking of a clock. Trevor and Paige were celebrating in their new penthouse, drinking champagne, bought with my money, planning a future on my grave. They thought they had won because they were faster. But in the world of high-stakes logistics, speed is nothing without a clear path. and I was about to turn their entire world into a dead end. The morning air in Missoula was crisp, the kind of cold that usually signaled a fresh start. But inside my hospital room, the atmosphere was suffocating. I lay there practicing the one skill I had mastered since the accident: stillness. I was a statue, a liability in a gown, waiting for the predators to enter the cage. The door swung open with a confidence that didn't belong in a place of healing. Trevor walked in, but he wasn't alone. Paige followed him, her heels clicking a sharp rhythmic staccato against the linoleum floor. She wasn't dressed for a hospital visit. She was dressed for a victory lap. Clutched in her hand was a limited edition Hermès Birkin in Vert de Gris, a bag that cost more than a mid-sized sedan. I recognized the leather. I recognized the gold hardware. Most importantly, I recognized the transaction. My phone had pinged with a fraud alert 2 days before the crash for that exact amount. Now I knew where it had gone. Trevor didn't offer a bouquet of wilted lilies this time. He didn't offer a kiss. He simply dropped a thick manila envelope onto my immobile legs. "Lily, we need to be adults about this," he said, his voice stripped of its previous honeyed facade. He stood at the foot of the bed, arms crossed, looking at me like a piece of equipment that had finally broken beyond repair. "The doctors say your recovery is a maybe at best. I'm a man in my prime, Lillian. I have a firm to run, a life to lead. I can't spend the next decade playing nurse to a quantitative modeler who can't even count her own steps." "What is this, Trevor?" I whispered, my voice intentionally thin and trembling. "Divorce papers," he said flatly, "but more importantly, it's a notice of the conservatorship hearing. I've already moved your personal savings into a managed holding account for safekeeping. Since you're clearly not in a state to make rational decisions, I'm stepping in to oversee the Vale Trust. It's for your own good." Paige drifted toward the side of my bed, sinking into the guest chair. She ran a manicured fingernail along the edge of my bedside table, her eyes roaming over my pale, ivy-bruised skin with a terrifying sense of triumph. "Don't look so sad, Lily," Paige cooed, swinging the Birkin onto her lap so I couldn't miss it. "Trevor is just doing the heavy lifting. You always were the brain of the family, the boring, calculating one. Well, the brain is broken now. It's time for the people who actually know how to live to take the wheel." "You used my card for that bag, Paige," I said, my voice barely audible. She laughed, a sharp tinkling sound that grated against my nerves. "Oh, honey, I used your card for the bag, the shoes, and the down payment on the new interior styling for Trevor's penthouse. Consider it a consulting fee for taking him off your hands. You're not a wife anymore. You're just a liability." Trevor nodded, checking his watch. "The hearing is in 72 hours, Lillian. Judith Carraway has already prepared the brief. The court will see a woman who can't walk, can't work, and can't even pay her own medical bills without my intervention. Don't fight it. It'll only make you look more unstable." I didn't scream. I didn't cry. To them, my silence was proof of my defeat. They saw a woman crushed by the weight of their cruelty. In reality, I was a quantitative risk modeler, and I was currently recording every word they said. Underneath the hospital sheets, my left hand, the one that still had a spark of motor function, was gripped around the burner phone Dr. Callister had taped to the underside of the bed frame. The voice memo app was running. "Once the conservatorship is approved, we're rich," Trevor had said in the hallway days ago. "You're a liability," he said now. Every word was a nail in his coffin. Every boast from Paige was a line item in a future lawsuit. I watched them, my eyes wide and misty, memorizing the way Trevor leaned into Paige, the way she smirked at my helplessness. I was documenting the peak of their arrogance, knowing that the higher they climbed, the more fatal the fall would be. "I understand," I whispered, closing my eyes as if exhausted. "Good," Trevor said, sounding relieved. "We'll see you in court, Lily. Or rather, your legal guardian will see you there." As the door clicked shut behind them, I opened my eyes. The liability was gone. In her place was a woman who had just acquired 100% of the evidence needed to trigger a bad faith clause in her grandmother's trust, a clause that would not only strip Trevor of any claim, but would allow me to pursue criminal fraud charges. I hit save on the recording. The day after Trevor and Paige's predatory visit, the atmosphere in my room shifted from a morgue to a war room. Dr. Callister stood guard at the door, her white coat a symbol of the sanctuary she was providing. In the guest chair where Paige had sat smirking just 24 hours ago, sat a man who looked like he was carved out of Montana granite. Calvin Driscoll didn't bring flowers. He brought a battered leather briefcase and a presence that demanded absolute silence. He was my grandmother Margot's oldest ally, the man who had drafted the legal blueprints for North Pass Freight Analytics. "You look like hell, Lillian," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. There was no pity in his eyes, only a clinical assessment of my strength. "I feel like a calculation with a rounding error, Calvin," I replied, my voice gaining strength. "Trevor is moving for the conservatorship. He's emptied my personal liquidity. He thinks he's found the bottleneck." Calvin flipped open his briefcase and pulled out a thick cream-colored folder embossed with the seal of the Rocky Mountain Private Bank. He laid it on my bedside table right over the spot where Trevor's divorce papers still sat. "He's playing a child's game with a master's board," Calvin said, tapping the folder. "Your grandmother Margot Vale didn't just leave you a fortune. She left you a fortress. This is the Vale Legacy Trust. Current valuation $22,400,000. I looked at the number. I knew it existed, but seeing it typed in black and white, verified by the Trust Administration Division, made the stakes feel lethal. Margot knew the world was full of men like Trevor Maddox. Calvin continued, leaning in. "The trust is protected by a bad faith and coercion trigger. Trevor cannot touch a cent of this money as a spouse. The only way he gains access to the management fees or the principal is if he is appointed your legal conservator, proving you are mentally incompetent to execute your own directives." "And if he succeeds?" I asked. "Then he becomes the gatekeeper. He won't own the money, but he'll control the flow. He'll bleed the trust dry through administrative expenses and lifestyle maintenance for his ward. By the time the courts notice, the $22 million will be a ghost." I felt the cold logic of the situation settling into my bones. Trevor wasn't just leaving me, he was attempting a hostile takeover of my entire existence. He needed the conservatorship because his own real estate firm was a house of cards, suffocating under high-interest bridge loans. My inheritance was his only exit strategy. "He thinks I'm broken," I whispered. "He thinks the crash scrambled my ability to process data." "Let him keep thinking that," Calvin said, a ghost of a smile appearing on his stern face. "In fact, I want him to be certain of it. I've already contacted the Missoula County Court clerk. We aren't going to contest his initial filing yet. We're going to let him march right into that hearing thinking he's the victor." I looked at my legs, still motionless beneath the sheets. "I need time, Calvin. I need to get into my grandmother's old servers. If I can prove he tampered with my car's diagnostics, or that he's been laundering his firm's debt through my personal accounts, the conservatorship won't just fail, it will become a criminal indictment." "I can buy you the time," Calvin promised. "But Lillian, you have to play the part. You have to be the liability he described. If he suspects you're communicating with me, he'll move the assets to an offshore shell company before we can freeze them. We need him arrogant. We need him loud." Total radio silence. I agreed. I want Trevor to feel so safe that he starts spending money he doesn't have yet. I want him to overextend. I want him to walk into that courtroom prepared to bury me, only to find out he's been digging his own grave. Calvin stood up, snapping his briefcase shut. "Revenge is emotional, Lillian. Evidence is permanent. I'll begin the shadow audit of his firm's holdings. You focus on the one thing he doesn't think you can do." "What's that?" "Waking up the lion," Margot raised. As Calvin slipped out of the room, Dr. Callister stepped back in. She looked at the monitors, then at me. My heart rate was steady, but my eyes were burning. "What's the plan?" she asked. "Dr. Callister." I said, my voice as cold as a Montana winter. "I need you to help me with a secret physical therapy schedule, late at night. No records in the main system. Trevor needs to believe I'm paralyzed, but by the day of that hearing, I intend to stand up." The transition from St. Patrick Medical Center to the Blackfoot Peak Rehabilitation Center was a tactical retreat. To Trevor and Paige, it looked like the final whimper of a broken woman. Because Trevor had generously frozen our joint accounts, the facility was technically being funded by a high-interest bridge loan Calvin had arranged through a third-party shell company. To the world, I was drowning in debt. To Trevor, I was a liability sinking into a hole he would never have to fill. The facility sat on the edge of Missoula, overlooking the swirling waters of the Clark Fork River. It was quiet, secluded, and most importantly, vetted by Dr. Callister. "Every step is a data point," Lillian, the head therapist, whispered during our 2 a.m. sessions. While the rest of the center slept, I was strapped into a robotic gait assistance harness. The pain in my lower back was a white-hot blade, but I welcomed it. Pain was feedback. Pain was proof that the neural pathways weren't dead, they were just muted. By the end of the first week, I could stand for 30 seconds. By the second, I was taking trembling, agonizing steps. But during the day, when the guardians came to visit, I remained in my wheelchair, a blanket draped over my legs, my gaze fixed vacantly on the mountain horizon. The vultures didn't take long to circle. Judith Carraway arrived on a Tuesday, trailing the scent of expensive sandalwood and cold bureaucracy. She didn't come alone. Trevor and Paige were flanking her like heirs to a throne they hadn't earned. Judith sat across from me, her iPad glowing with spreadsheets that I knew were fabrications. "Lillian," Judith said, her voice like brushed steel. "As a consultant for the Maddox estate, my priority is stability. Trevor tells me you've been unresponsive to the reality of your situation. The medical bills at Blackfoot are mounting. Your personal credit rating has plummeted 60 points in 30 days. I'm just so tired, Judith," I whispered, keeping my hands trembling slightly on the armrests. "Which is why the conservatorship is a mercy." Judith continued, sliding a document toward me. "I've designed a management structure for the Vale Trust. It moves the administrative burden to Trevor's firm, allowing you to focus entirely on your recovery. We just need your signature on this preliminary acknowledgement of incapacity." Paige leaned against the window frame, checking her reflection in her phone screen. "Just sign it, Lily. You're literally bankrupting Trevor with these therapy sessions. It's selfish, really. You're holding on to money you can't even count anymore." I looked at Trevor. He didn't meet my eyes. He was busy looking at a real estate prospectus on his own phone, likely the downtown penthouse he planned to buy the moment the trust unlocked. "I need time to think," I stammered, my voice cracking perfectly. "You don't have time," Trevor snapped, finally looking up. His patience was fraying. The debt from his failing developments was clearly squeezing him. "The court hearing is in 10 days. If you don't cooperate, Judith will testify that you're being combative and delusional. Do you want to spend the rest of your life in a state-run ward? Because that's where you're headed if I don't step in." I let a tear fall. It was the easiest part of the performance. "Fine. Leave the papers. I'll try to read them." As they left, Paige blew a mocking kiss. "Get well soon, sis. Or don't. Honestly, the chair suits your personality." Static. The moment the door clicked shut, the shaking in my hands stopped. I stood up. It took every ounce of my willpower to keep my balance without the walker, but I stood. I walked to the door, locked it, and pulled a hidden, encrypted laptop from the lining of my suitcase, a gift delivered by Calvin's courier. I didn't open the documents Judith left. I didn't need to. I knew her management structure was a funnel designed to siphon $22.4 million into Trevor's Maddox Highlands project within 48 hours of the judge's signature. Instead, I logged into the North Pass Freight Analytics backend. My grandmother had given me the master administrative key years ago. Calvin, I said into my headset as the encrypted line connected. The bait is taken. They think I'm broken. Trevor just confirmed he's using Judith to commit perjury regarding my mental state. And the financial side? Calvin asked. I've just initiated a shadow buyback. I replied, my fingers flying across the keys, manifesting the cold precision of the risk modeler I had always been. Through the shell company, I've just purchased 70% of Trevor's outstanding commercial debt from the Rocky Mountain Private Bank. He doesn't know it yet, but I am no longer just his wife. I paused, watching the confirmation flash green on the screen. I am now his primary creditor, and as of today, I'm calling in the loans. The hearing is in 10 days. Lillian, Calvin reminded me, are you ready to walk into that courtroom? I'm not just going to walk in, Calvin, I said, looking at my reflection in the dark laptop screen. I'm going to dismantle them. In the world of quantitative risk, there is a maneuver known as short squeezing, trapping an arrogant investor in a position where their only exit is a total loss. As I sat in my darkened room at Blackfoot Peak, my fingers danced across the keyboard of the encrypted laptop. Trevor thought he was playing a game of checkers, trying to snatch my king. He didn't realize I was dismantling the very floor he was standing on. Through a series of offshore LLCs managed by Calvin Driscoll, I had initiated the shadow buyback. The first target was Trevor's Achilles heel, his Mountain View penthouse, and the aggressive bridge loans fueling his Maddox Highlands development. The bank was more than happy to sell the paper. Lillian, Calvin's voice crackled through my headset. They've been worried about Trevor's debt-to-income ratio for months. They jumped at the chance to offload his $4.2 million mortgage to an anonymous institutional investor at a 15% discount. Good, I whispered, my eyes reflecting the glow of the screen. As of 9 a.m., I am officially his landlord. What about the brokerage? Done, Calvin replied. Maddox Real Estate Group was struggling. I've acquired 51% of the parent company's voting shares through the Vail Trust's secret emergency acquisition fund. Your husband is now an employee of a company you secretly own. It was the ultimate irony. While Trevor was at his favorite steakhouse in downtown Missoula, bragging to Paige about the $22.4 million windfall they were about to inherit, I was signing the digital warrants that would freeze his commissions. He was spending money that technically belonged to me to live in a house that I now owned, working for a firm where I held the power to fire him with a single keystroke. Meanwhile, Paige was living the high life on my dime. My internal audit of the credit diversion trail showed she had spent $140,000 in the last 3 weeks alone. Designer clothes, a private jet charter to Aspen, and a collection of jewelry that she'd surely regret when the bailiffs arrived. I didn't stop the transactions. Every swipe of that card was another nail in the coffin of their good faith defense. The most dangerous player, however, was Judith Carraway. She arrived at my room 2 days before the hearing, looking triumphant. She held a stack of asset management transfer documents. These weren't just for the trust. They were designed to give Trevor immediate unfettered access to the North Pass Freight Analytics servers. Lillian, I've refined the conservatorship plan, Judith said, her voice dripping with artificial empathy. To ensure the legacy remains intact, we need to consolidate the data analytics division under Trevor's direct supervision. It's a standard move for impaired beneficiaries. I looked at the documents. Judith had been clever. She had inserted clauses that would indemnify her and Trevor from any loss of value during the transition. In her arrogance, she had also signed her own name as the independent financial auditor, certifying my mental incapacity. I trust you, Judith, I said, my voice barely a tremor. I picked up the pen with a shaking hand and scrawled a jagged, barely legible signature on the bottom line. The moment she left clutching those papers like a winning lottery ticket, I sent a message to Calvin. She signed it. The independent auditor just certified a fraudulent transfer of assets to a person who is currently in default on 3 of his own loans that I now hold. This isn't just a civil dispute anymore, Calvin. This is RICO territory. She's walked right into the trap, Calvin confirmed. She just signed a legal document swearing that Trevor is financially stable enough to manage $22 million, while my office has the records proving he's technically insolvent as of this morning. It's perjury and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. I leaned back in my wheelchair, feeling the phantom itch in my legs. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like a patient. I felt like a predator. Trevor and Paige were planning their victory ball for the night after the hearing. They had invited the Missoula elite, signaling their arrival as the new power couple of the Rocky Mountains. They thought they were at the finish line. They didn't realize that in my world, the finish line is just where the liquidation begins. The walls of Trevor's carefully constructed empire were beginning to sweat. In the world of quantitative risk, you don't always need to strike the killing blow immediately. Sometimes you simply increase the pressure until the structure collapses from its own internal tension. The first crack appeared at a high-end boutique in downtown Missoula. Paige was in the middle of a celebratory shopping spree, her arms draped with designer silk and Italian leather. When she handed over the platinum card, the one linked to my supposedly managed account, the machine didn't beep with its usual approval. Instead, it emitted a long, flat rejection tone. "I'm sorry, Ms. Maddox," the clerk said, her voice echoing in the quiet store. "The transaction was declined. It says account restricted by primary creditor." Paige's face turned a shade of crimson that matched her stolen lipstick. She tried 3 other cards. Each one failed. She didn't know that 3 floors up in a secure server room I now effectively controlled, the risk mitigation protocols had been triggered. At the same time, Trevor was sitting in his glass-walled office at the Maddox Real Estate Group, staring at his monitor. An automated notice of default had just landed in his inbox. It wasn't from the bank. It was from Vail Holdings LLC, the anonymous entity that had purchased his mortgage and business loans. "Dear Mr. Maddox, your primary credit facilities have been flagged for high-risk activity. Per the acceleration clause in your contract, the full balance of $4.2 million is due within 48 hours unless a liquidity guarantee is provided." Trevor's hands shook. He was bleeding out, and the only bandage big enough to stop the flow was the $22.4 million trust he was 24 hours away from seizing. That evening, I sent him a text from the burner phone. "Trevor, I'm scared about the hearing tomorrow. Can you come to the rehab center? Just us. I need to know we're still a team." He arrived 30 minutes later, looking frayed but predatory. He thought he was coming to deliver a final blow to a broken woman. I sat in my wheelchair, my legs covered by a heavy wool blanket, looking smaller and more fragile than ever. "Lily, you need to understand," Trevor said, pacing the room like a caged animal. He didn't even pretend to be sympathetic anymore. "The banks are breathing down my neck because of your medical bills. Everything is a mess because you're not functional. Tomorrow is just a formality to fix what you broke." "Is that why you're doing this?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "For the money." Trevor let out a sharp, jagged laugh. "Of course it's for the money. Do you have any idea what it's like being married to a human calculator who monitors every cent? I deserve this. I've put in the time. And soon I'll control the entire trust. Every penny. I've already signed the allocation orders for the North Pass accounts." "But I never signed those, Trevor," I said softly. He smirked, leaning down until his face was inches from mine. "You didn't have to. Paige is a better artist than you ever were. Your signature on the incapacity acknowledgement, perfection. By the time any forensic auditor looks at it, we'll be halfway to the Caymans with the first $5 million. From the doorway, Paige stepped in, swinging her empty shopping bags in frustration. "He's right, Lily. We even used the timestamp logs from the hospital's Wi-Fi to make it look like you signed it during a lucid interval while you were drugged up. It's foolproof. You're a vegetable on paper, and on paper we're geniuses." I looked at them both, the man I had once loved, and the sister I had tried to protect. They were gloating over a grave they hadn't realized was their own. "You really think the judge won't see through this?" I asked. "The judge only sees what's in the folder, Lillian," Trevor said, grabbing his coat. "And Judith Caraway has made sure that folder says you're a lost cause. Sleep well. Tomorrow I become the man I was always meant to be." As they walked out, their laughter echoing down the hallway, I reached under the blanket. I pulled out the small, high-fidelity digital recorder that had been taped to the underside of the wheelchair. I hit the stop button and immediately uploaded the file to Calvin Driscoll's secure cloud server. "Calvin," I whispered into the room's hidden microphone, "I have the confession. Forgery, wire fraud, and conspiracy. They've admitted to everything on record." "I have the audio, Lillian." Calvin's voice came through my earpiece, steady and cold. "And I have the bank's confirmation of the default. The trap is set. All that's left is the performance." "I'm ready," I said. I gripped the armrests of the wheelchair, and with a surge of agonizing but triumphant strength, I stood up. I walked 3 steady steps to the window and watched Trevor's car pull away. The storm was coming to Missoula, and I was the one who had written the forecast. The glass-walled conference room of the Rocky Mountain Private Bank overlooked the snow-dusted peaks of Missoula. It was a cathedral of high finance, smelling of expensive mahogany and the cold scent of impending ruin. Trevor sat at the head of the polished obsidian table, wearing a $4,000 charcoal suit he'd bought on a credit line I had secretly acquired 48 hours prior. To his left sat Paige, draped in silk, scrolling through real estate listings for a villa in Cabo. To his right was Judith Caraway, her professional mask as sharp and impenetrable as a diamond. Arrayed across from them were the bank's trustees and a phalanx of corporate attorneys. I was wheeled in by a nurse draped in an oversized cardigan, my gaze fixed on my lap. To everyone in that room, I was the subject, a broken asset to be reassigned. "Thank you all for coming." Trevor began, his voice booming with a confidence that bordered on megalomania. "Today is about stability. My wife Lillian has suffered a catastrophic cognitive decline. To protect the Vale legacy, we are here to finalize the transition of the $22.4 million trust to the Maddox Management Group, effective immediately." Judith slid a thick stack of documents toward the lead trustee. "As the independent auditor, I have verified the necessity of this conservatorship. Lillian's recent financial instability and her inability to process basic logistics make her a danger to the fund's longevity." The lead trustee, a gray-haired man named Miller, looked at me. "Mrs. Maddox, do you have anything to say before we certify the transfer?" I didn't look up. I let out a shaky, rehearsed breath. I just want to know where the money is going." Trevor rolled his eyes, a smirk playing on his lips. "It's going into safe hands, Lily. Don't worry your head about the numbers anymore. Just let the adults handle it." Calvin Driscoll, who had been sitting silently in the corner, suddenly stood up. "Mr. Miller, before you sign, my client has requested a final review of the evidence used to support this claim of incapacity. Specifically, the audio logs from St. Patrick Medical Center's recovery wing." Trevor chuckled. "Calvin, we've already been through this. The medical records are clear." "Not those records," Calvin said, his voice dropping to a deadly resonant pitch. "I'm referring to the records Trevor and Paige Maddox created themselves." Calvin tapped a button on his tablet. The dual 80-inch monitors on the wall flickered to life. The audio was crystal clear. It wasn't a grainy hospital recording. It was the high-fidelity capture from the burner phone I had hidden. "Once the conservatorship is signed, the trust money is ours." Trevor's voice echoed through the boardroom, cold and predatory. The room went deathly silent. Trevor's smirk vanished, replaced by a gray, sickly pallor. "Even if she wakes up, she won't walk again. And legally, everything becomes mine." The recording continued. Then came Paige's voice, sharp and mocking. "What about the trust money?" And Trevor's chilling response. "Once the conservatorship is approved, we're rich." But the killing blow was the recording from the previous night, the confession. "Paige is a better artist than you ever were," Trevor's recorded voice bragged. "Your signature on the incapacity acknowledgement perfection. By the time any forensic auditor looks at it, we'll be halfway to the Caymans." Judith Carraway's pen hit the table with a sharp clack. She looked at the monitors, then at Trevor, her professional facade disintegrating into pure terror. She realized she hadn't just audited a trust. She had signed her name to a felony conspiracy. This is a fabrication," Trevor shouted, slamming his hands on the table. "She's delusional. She's using AI to frame me." I looked up then. The fog in my eyes was gone, replaced by the razor-sharp clarity of a quantitative risk modeler who had just completed her final calculation. "The audio has been forensically verified by the Montana 4th Judicial District's Digital Forensics Unit, Trevor." I said, my voice steady and crystalline. "The timestamps on those recordings match the exact moments you were accessing my accounts from the hospital Wi-Fi. It's not just betrayal, it's wire fraud, it's forgery, and it's attempted grand larceny." Paige stood up, her face twisted in rage. "You bitch! You were faking it. You let us spend that money, just to trap us." "I didn't let you do anything, Paige," I replied, standing up from the wheelchair with slow, deliberate strength. The entire room gasped as I walked unsupported to the head of the table. "You made your own choices. I just tracked the data." I turned to Mr. Miller. "As the sole beneficiary of the Vail Trust, I am exercising my right to terminate the Maddox Management Group's involvement effective 10 seconds ago. Furthermore, as the primary creditor of Trevor Maddox's personal and business debts, which I now own in full, I am declaring an immediate default." I leaned over the table, looking Trevor directly in his hollow, terrified eyes. "You wanted to be the man you were always meant to be, Trevor. Well, look at the screen. You're exactly who I thought you were. A 0 on the ledger." The heavy oak doors of the Rocky Mountain Private Bank's executive suite didn't just open, they were conquered. For weeks, the world had seen Lillian Hartwell as a broken variable, a liability in a wheelchair. But as the click of Italian leather heels echoed against the marble foyer, that illusion shattered. I didn't need the chair. I didn't need the blanket. I wore a tailored black power suit, my silhouette sharp against the backdrop of the Montana skyline. My stride was measured, a testament to the thousands of agonizing midnight steps I had taken, while my enemies were busy dreaming of my fortune. I walked directly to the head of the obsidian table, stopping only when I was inches from Trevor. The room was paralyzed. Paige's mouth hung open, her expensive latte cooling on the table. Judith Carraway looked as if she had seen a ghost, one that had come to audit her soul. "You look surprised, Trevor," I said, my voice cutting through the silence like a diamond through glass. "Did you think a few broken bones could stop a mind trained in risk mitigation? I never lost control. I was simply waiting for the data to be complete." I placed my hands flat on the table, leaning in. In logistics, we call this the final mile. It's the most expensive and most dangerous part of the journey. For you, it's where the road ends. Calvin Driscoll stepped forward, placing a sleek black briefcase on the table. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He opened it to reveal a mountain of digital forensics and physical evidence. "Mr. Miller, members of the board." Calvin's voice was a funeral bell. "We are here today not to discuss a conservatorship, but to document a criminal conspiracy. We have the hospital corridor recordings where Mr. Maddox and Miss Paige Maddox discussed liquidating the trust. We have the digital signature timestamps showing that the incapacity acknowledgement was signed from an IP address assigned to Trevor Maddox's private office, while my client was under general anesthesia." Calvin pulled out a final sheet, the steel evidence. "And most importantly, we have the internal audit of the Maddox Real Estate Group. Every cent spent on Ms. Paige's shopping sprees and the down payment on the new penthouse was siphoned from the Vail Trust through a series of forged medical expense vouchers." "It's a lie," Trevor screamed, his face a contorted mask of desperation. He reached for the documents, but Calvin swiped them away. "Judith, tell them, you certified the accounts." Judith Caraway didn't speak. She couldn't. She was staring at the door. The heavy doors opened again, but this time it wasn't a lawyer who entered. 4 officers from the Missoula Police Department, led by a detective in a plain suit, walked in. The metallic jingle of handcuffs was the only sound in the room. "Trevor Maddox, Judith Caraway," the detective asked, "you are under arrest for grand larceny, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit forgery. You have the right to remain silent." The boardroom erupted. Paige began to sob, her hands shaking so violently she dropped her stolen designer clutch. Judith was stoic, her eyes dead as the officers turned her around and snapped the cuffs onto her wrists. But Trevor didn't go quietly. He lunged across the table, his eyes bloodshot. "You did this. You trapped me. I'm your husband, Lillian." I didn't flinch. I stood my ground, watching him as the officers tackled him to the carpet, the sounds of his struggling echoing off the glass walls. "No, Trevor," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that only he could hear as they hauled him up. "I didn't trap you. I just gave you the credit line to hang yourself. You're not my husband. You're just a bad debt I've finally written off." As they were led out in a procession of shame, the bank's trustees sat in stunned silence. The liability had just executed the most perfect hostile takeover in the history of the firm. I turned to Calvin, who was calmly packing his briefcase. "Is the liquidation of his firm complete?" "As of 5 minutes ago, Lillian," Calvin replied. "You are the 100% owner of the Maddox Real Estate Group. What would you like to do with the assets?" I looked out at the Missoula Mountains, the sun finally breaking through the mist. "Sell the penthouse. Liquidate the luxury cars. Take every cent they thought they stole and put it back into the North Pass Foundation for Spinal Research." I picked up the pen, the same one Judith had used to try and steal my life, and signed the final order of dissolution. "The audit is closed," I said, "and the risk has been neutralized." The dust in Missoula finally settled, not with a bang but with the rhythmic, clinical sound of a gavel hitting a wooden block. 6 months after the confrontation at Rocky Mountain Private Bank, the final variables of the Maddox risk model were permanently archived in the Montana Department of Corrections. Trevor Maddox stood in the 4th Judicial District Court, his $4,000 suit replaced by a drab orange jumpsuit. The real estate visionary was sentenced to 12 years for grand larceny, wire fraud, and conspiracy. As the bailiffs led him away, he didn't look like a predator anymore. He looked like a rounding error. Judith Caraway's fall was quieter but no less absolute. The Montana Office of the Commissioner of Securities and Insurance stripped her of her licenses and barred her from wealth management for life. Her wealth guardian reputation was incinerated, replaced by a permanent record of professional perjury. As for Paige, the stylist, found that her aesthetic was useless in a world where her credit score was 0. After the bank seized her stolen jewelry and the Hermes Birkin to pay back the trust, she quietly packed a single suitcase and left Missoula on a Greyhound bus. In a city built on logistics, she had run out of routes. I stood on the balcony of the penthouse one last time. The keys were already on the counter for the new owners, a young family who would fill the halls with laughter instead of whispered conspiracies. I didn't feel sadness. I felt the lightness of a balanced ledger. The proceeds from the sale of Trevor's firm and the penthouse didn't go into my personal account. Instead, I established the Margot Vale Recovery Foundation. Its mission was simple, providing high-end, off-the-books robotic physical therapy for trauma victims who, like me, were being written off by their insurance companies or their families. Calvin Driscoll stood beside me as I signed the foundation's charter. "You could have kept it all, Lillian. The law would have allowed it." "Data doesn't lie, Calvin," I said, looking out at the sprawling mountain corridor that my grandmother had loved. And the data says that holding on to the past is a high-risk, low-reward investment. I walked to my car, a modest armored SUV without a limp, without a cane, and without a husband, without a As I drove past the Missoula city limits, I looked in the rearview mirror one last time. Money doesn't change people. It only removes the mask. And once the mask is off, you finally see the true cost of everything. Have you ever been betrayed by your own family or had someone try to tear you down for what you worked for? I want to hear your story in the comments below. How did you rebuild,